Welcome. My name is Matt Ampleman, and I'm a third-year law student at Yale Law School.
And my name is Tarleton Watkins, and I'm a first-year student of religion at Yale Divinity School. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Richard Norgaard, Professor Emeritus of Energy and Natural Resources at the University of California at Berkeley. This interview is one of a series of interviews with guests in a course called Law, Environment, and Religion, an interdisciplinary course at Yale University, jointly offered by Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Yale Law School, and Yale Divinity School.
Dr. Norgaard is at the vanguard of ecological economics, a field of analysis that looks at people, markets, ecosystems, and society in an integrated way. He has served as the president of the International Society of Ecological Economics, as a visiting scholar at the World Bank, as an advisor to President Nixon on the fledgling Council for Environmental Quality, and as much, much more. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention his roles as a teacher, as a mentor, as a whitewater rafter and guide, and as an encourager to others in the environmental movement. In these roles, Dr. Norgaard has prodded the dismal science of economics to acknowledge less dismal dynamic realities. He has served alternately as a prophet for the rest of us, guiding us to take responsibility and build robust social conversations towards protecting the environment. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Norgaard.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure.
Before you started your PhD at the University of Chicago in economics, you published a couple of papers on fluvial geomorphology.
Correct.
Really digging into the past here. I bring it up, and for our audience, fluvial geomorphology is a field that deals with stream channels and the rocky substrate and the air channel above the stream and all these things. It's a really dynamic field. And I'm wondering if you find a similar dynamism in your topic of study now, or if you miss anything about fluvial geomorphology.
The fluvial geomorphology, though I was a river runner and extremely interested in how to miss those rocks and swim the rapids and come out okay, the papers are somewhat of a fluke in my academic career. I was doing a master's dissertation at Oregon State University. I decided to investigate how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimated the benefits and costs of upstream hydro projects on transportation, on navigation. And they kept claiming tremendous benefits. Build another dam, you regulate the stream flow, and there's all these navigation benefits. I went to Portland, Oregon, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers office, and said, well, how'd you come up with these estimates of multi-million dollars? And they said, well, the guy that did that isn't here anymore. Well, does he have some files? Not that we know of. Well, how would you do it if you were doing it now? Darned if I know. So basically these were made-up numbers, totally from scratch, and I've come across this in other situations as well. And so I set out to figure a way to do it myself. I had all sorts of charts of the soundings of the channel in the lower Columbia River from Portland to the sea, Astoria, and I would calculate the quantities of silt that had been laid down between dredging periods and the amount of silt dredged, and be able to calculate then looking at that over a 28-year period, how did stream flow affect the amount of silt being carried from the river.
And how did you enjoy that? Was that a fun project? It sounds tedious at points.
There were tedious times. I was down in the basement of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and coming out for lunch. And yes, it was tedious. But at that particular time in life, it gave me time to reflect, and it was okay. It was okay.
It sounds like there are perhaps similar capabilities across the two disciplines, or at least your role in challenging orthodoxy. Do you think that's constant across your work?
I think that is. I certainly went into fluvial geomorphology because the people who were supposed said they were doing it weren't doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I have that frustration with economics also, that there's not enough there, and I try to go about and do something about it.
Well, maybe if you had stuck in fluvial geomorphology, we would have corrected a few more errors of the Corps of Engineers. Now, there's a lot of beauty in your writing. You write for academic audiences, but you also write for popular audiences. And I think you call out other authors for having too thin a view of beauty or of spirituality and spiritual awakening. In your essay, for example, Beyond Materialism, you start with a critique of Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance. And you say that Gore has too thin a view of what an environmental and spiritual awakening should entail. That he calls us to summon collective moral resolve through religious narratives, but once we overcome our, quote, material madness, he would install a different technocratic regime through the Global Marshall Plan. Is that a fair reading of your critique? And then what role should beauty or should spirituality play in our collective project?
And I think this is true, that at the age of 18, I was in the Glen Canyon of the Colorado before Lake Powell, with David Brower, with Elliot Porter, with Philip Hyde, other famous photographers, and it was just an extremely beautiful place. And the role that beauty and the loss of that beauty played in my understanding of what life is about probably does show up in my critique of Gore's Marshall Plan to save Western civilization, but then maybe we end up doing another stupid thing. And so I do have a vision of a utopia where we have more time for beauty, for sharing, for less materialism. And
Do you see others that are creating that time and space now? I think you do to a certain extent.
Well, certainly there is the beginnings of an area called the environmental humanities, where there's so far the environmental humanities are mostly humanities scholars looking at our environmental history, our environmental beliefs, but it could evolve and become more of a envisioning project, and re-envisioning what civilization might be about. I mean, when I was studying economics, we were talking about the near coming of the 30-hour week, and that people needed more time, and we would be spending more time with our musical instruments and our paintbrushes and our ping pong paddles, and then really in the 60s we were talking about that, and then it very emphatically did not happen that way. We just kept consuming more and more and taking more to the dump. Yeah.
So you think there's a link between self-care and our care of the environment?
Self-care is...
You can say it different ways.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about self-care because I don't know anyone...
This isn't a self-help book.
Yeah, because 9 out of 10 self-help books are how to get ahead and how to live in the existing system, and not how to sort of isolate yourself and live a different life. It's more how to join than how to set out an alternative. Certainly different. Very few of them that I don't read self-help books, but I don't know of any that are really thinking of envisioning another future.
No.
Well, I'd like to perhaps speak a little bit about that existing system, which you describe as an econoscene in several of your works, and also your ideas of coevolution that were topics of discussion in our class. Specifically, in Escaping Economism, you write, quote, "The belief that evolution is a slow process is still embedded in the public consciousness." And that as a response to this, you've written in your book, Development Betrayed, about understanding a, quote, "social system more thoroughly by breaking it into 4 subsystems: values, knowledge, organization, and technology." And that you envision a process wherein each system interacts with the others in direct mechanical ways while they also co-evolve together, selecting on current characteristics as well as innovations and introductions in each other, while also interacting and co-evolving with the natural system. I think something that piqued our interest was a question of what are the natural limits to our human understanding of coevolution as a gradual versus rapid response.
And I first started, becoming serious about evolution, working with biological control practitioners. I mean, there were entomologists who were ecologists who were thinking in evolutionary terms, because insects can have 25 generations in a single season, and can become resistant in a season or two to a pesticide. And so very early in the early 70s, I was introduced to evolution through insects, and they evolve fast. The real puzzle in my mind is how insects can evolve real fast, and redwood trees, that reproduce very rarely, coexist. How come the insects haven't learned how to eat up the redwood trees who evolve so slowly? And there's a lot of mysteries, but evolution is both fast and slow. And of course, bacteria can be much quicker than insects.
Certainly. So as we think about maybe the more mechanistic evolution of our current time, of the econoscene, how have we co-evolved with each other, with other natural systems, with plants and animals, the non-human living world?
Well, we are co-evolving. We're just co-evolving to extinction. And so co-evolving is not positive or negative. It is just a description of a process. So then the question is, how do you really think of it as, how do we bring it into a positive process? And I think, first of all, we do have to understand that we are co-evolving. If we think we can mechanistically control the world, well, in fact, we're in a co-evolving system. We'll make a lot of mistakes, and we have. But you're still stuck with this problem of, can human will a co-evolutionary process,
Right.
which is richer for people and richer for nature? And I think we could, but I think diversity has to be really in the forefront of that sort of thinking. And I think you really need to work on a value system, not just concentrate on technological fixes.
Sure. And do you feel as though we've co-evolved into our current landscape of an econoscene?
It's been 23 years since I published that. And you just read it.
No, yeah.
But my mind still works that way. But it's not a pattern of thinking that gives you instructions. It doesn't. It's not predictive. It doesn't give you control. And so it is a pattern of thinking which, in many ways, we would have to release our sense of control. We would have to be more receptive to the beauty of the diversity of the world we live in, and in some sense worship that. And that is just so different from a worldview of the world is just a clock, and we just need to learn how to make it run the way we want it to run. So if you switch to a co-evolutionary framework, you just have to kind of move out as to how do we do it, and put your faith in sort of what coevolution can tell you. But I would run a lot of experiments. And so that book ends with what I refer to as a coevolutionary patchwork quilt, that not being able to say what is best. Let's not all be in a globalized world. Let's have multiple coevolutionary experiments and have a little learning between them. And I just have more faith or more hope for that sort of a world.
So this actually picks up on the next point that I'd like to treat, which is something you write about also in Beyond Materialism, which is an expression of a skeptical view of the state, and maybe zooming out a little bit, a skeptical view of the neoliberal global frameworks that have gotten us to where we are now.
Yes.
And you write that there's a new communicative process that is breaking down the barriers created by materialist philosophy that could evolve into a major form of social organization that increasingly diminishes the importance of state and science as they've been known. And so there's more, but I won't read it. One critique of neoliberalism is that it would have us create a resurgent state that is no longer the protector of and handmaided to the market. And are your qualms about the state specific to the state's role as handmaiden to the market, or is there a deeper concern about the state's ability to counter and control materialism?
So the state that we now have and the state that we have trying to force upon the rest of the world is very driven by the neoliberal worldview. And that state is very undesirable in my mind. At the same time, we have to have community, we have to have shared values, we have to have, within co-evolving patchworks, we have to have shared values, but we need some sort of global shared just to make sure that no particular patch does what we have done with hydrocarbons, for example. So there has to be collective processes in which we regulate each other. There has to be, in some sense, you can use the word social control. It's, to some people, more obnoxious than the idea of the state. But if its social control is built on community and community understanding, it becomes more acceptable. But I guess Karl Mannheim in the 50s wrote the 20s, and updated a book on utopias and ideologies. And for every ideology, there needs to be a utopia. And I think my utopia is a utopia of valuing people, of learning people, of people who are respectful and are sharing. And that's very different than the utopia of unlimited material stuff. And so it is a utopia of people being social and smart and appreciative of beauty in all the ways it is presented to us.
Sure.
And if you put your emphasis on that, I think we have more hope.
And this touches a little bit on your ideas that you've shared about the role and importance of deliberative or discursive democracy.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. So deliberative democracy really brings more people into the process of deciding what is the correct thing to do. And we have clearly made a monstrous mistake over the last 50 years thinking the neoliberal dream would actually work out for everybody, while it was in fact working out for the rich and not for the poor. And this is why Clinton lost. And this is why we're in this strange world now. Yeah.
So, shifting gears slightly, could you perhaps tell us what it was like to be at the University of Chicago in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and then to be a young professional in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s, at a time of market shift and upheaval in the political world? And of course, the Chicago School largely preceded you, but this was a time of dramatic ideological shifts toward market fundamentalism in our policy and in academic circles.
Yes.
Is that a shift that was perceptible to you at the time?
It was not. Coming from Berkeley, which was doing the mathematical economics and was dreaming a progressive dream, the Chicago perception of the way the world should be organized was not, to me it was an outlier. I was inside of it. It was okay to be inside of it because I knew I wasn't stuck in it. And then 15 years later, I am stuck in it. And so I didn't see it coming. And in retrospect, when I was an undergraduate, we were really taught that a mixed economy is necessary. We really need government to control markets. We really need markets to fill in for the things that government can't do. There really are public goods, certainly education, certainly highways, certainly dams. The big projects needed to be done publicly and with public decision making. And then the whole environmental movement was very much sort of the limits of markets, that markets couldn't do everything, and you needed other forms of social control. I'm actually going back to a 1900s language of a sociologist, Ross. And, but, it can be government, but it can also be social norms. It doesn't have to be government. It can be just good people sharing the right norms. And so I didn't see it coming, and it was extremely discouraging. And in retrospect, I think it was because the mathematical economists, though they had sort of this mixed economy understanding, had no political philosophy of their own to counter the neoliberal philosophy. And so it was really the absence of a philosophy that was both on the right and on the left, and then neoliberalism just picks it up. And we end up with Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl in 1980, and then 1993, Bill Clinton also adopts neoliberalism, and we're just totally locked in. It was
It's a bit of a bleak picture.
well. The only positive side is that I didn't see that coming, and I still have hope there's other stuff coming. and I think there can be. I really think there can be.
Some of us in this room have maybe spent our whole lives in that
neoliberal bubble.
In that neoliberal moment that you're describing. Certainly from Reagan onward, or even from 1993 onward.
Yes.
But we still have communities. We still have, our own small resistances. You talked about just a minute ago the need for community and the need for shared values. I'm wondering, what do you have in mind if there's a community that you participate in? That you feel most at home in, or that you feel is connected to this project?
Certainly students make up community for many professors,
Mm-hmm.
and the energy and resources graduate students have been my community.
Uh-huh.
And being retired for nearly 4 years now, I feel the absence.
Mm-hmm.
But I can still go back to the campus, and there'll be swarms of students around me.
Mm-hmm.
In 2 weeks, I'll have 20 students up to my home, out on the deck discussing what is absent since I've left the program and what they still feel they need. And it'll be brand new students and students that I have also taught. So that community goes on. I find that almost everybody has a scientific facade or a professional facade, and yet they're still people. And if you just start speaking to them as people, it's very, very easy to communicate. And I guess I have a little bit of a knack to do that. I just find that a lot of people I find to be friends.
Yeah.
And they tend to be in the environmental science community much more than the economics community. But then I have the pleasure of being in communication with theologians and sociologists and political scientists and a few people in law.
The university seems like a really wonderful place for that. Maybe Berkeley especially.
That gets to the flip side.
Yeah.
And the flip side that many conversations today have been, but don't I have to have a specialty? Don't I have to fit into some department? Isn't the university, we've been talking about interdisciplinary from the 1970s. You can find in earlier literature back in the 1930s, and yet we're not very interdisciplinary. And those of us who have been interdisciplinary have usually paid a price for it. So I was reviewed by economists all the way through, and needless to say, they did not appreciate everything I wrote. Yeah.
On the other hand, economists can wade out into other fields without their companions.
Yes.
And make their own proclamations.
It is true that economics has lots of borders and lots of ways in which and I certainly was able to take advantage of that, to early on be able to do economics and petroleum together, and then do economics and biological control pests together, and then be off in the Amazon and looking at development in the Amazon and economics. And it still retained some of my Chicago training while also searching for other things. So yes, it is an entree.
Have those borders, working at those borders, and have those interdisciplinary friendships more than connections, do you think that those have helped you preserve your countercurrent voice?
I'm absolutely dependent upon it.
Okay.
It was the Glen Canyon experience and the Glen Canyon experience with David Brower in particular that made me mad enough to go to the University of Chicago. And mad in that good, crazy sense. But mad also in just deeply irritated. And I would have preferred to have been a fluviogeomorphologist. I loved biology. I still love biology more than I love economics. And yet I knew I needed to go into economics. And yet it's always because I've been able to reach out to the other disciplines and find friendship and ways of communicating better that have saved me.
It's certainly part of the project for this class. We have students from the law school, students from the divinity school, students from the forestry school. We don't have a trip to Glen Canyon.
No.
We couldn't in the same way. Can you tell us a little bit more about that trip? We've glanced off of it. Maybe just, was it one trip or was it several trips?
It was 8 weeks on 6 trips.
Okay.
And David Brower had argued that it would be unnecessary to build a dam at Dinosaur, which is now Dinosaur National Park. You could just build Glen Canyon 35 feet higher, the Glen Canyon Dam. And he had never seen the Glen Canyon. and the Dinosaur Dam was stopped. And Glen Canyon was built 35 feet higher. And so that argument was done in the mid-50s, and in 1962, June, he comes on a trip down the Glen Canyon with me, and he just, his whole career, he just feels has been the biggest, stupidest mistake he'd ever made in his life. And it radicalized David Brower. He never again would say, do it here instead of there. He would just say, don't. And always point out the problems. And I saw that transformation. I was part of that, piece of it. I was integral to it. Through Elliot Porter, he was amazingly skilled at picking out pieces of a very grand picture and coming up with a piece which was just exquisite. And, Ansel Adams is always the big grand picture, or not almost always. And Ansel Adams just focuses in. And even though you're just surrounded by grandness, he helped me just see the, particular beauties. One of the things he taught me to do was to let my eyes go to infinity at a creek that's 6 feet in front of me. And then all of a sudden you see all the reflective light. And if you're really looking at just 6 feet in front of you, you do not see that reflective light.
That's really beautiful. Really beautiful to let your eyes go to infinity when staring at a creek 6 feet in front of you. It seems like a paradox.
But it's there.
Yeah.
The beauty is there.
So a lot of this trip was about photography. Were all of you photographers?
We had
you
one.
You were taking photographs yourself.
Yes, I had a strong desire to be a photographer. David Brower is an excellent photographer, and he was publishing the tabletop coffee table books at the time, the great big, and just getting nature out to, into everybody's, or not every people who could afford these books. They were very expensive at the time, and so the visual part was extremely important to these trips, and there was one 14-day trip when it was all photography.
Maybe we should have a few photographers in this class if we don't already. Would you like to pick it up?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'd like to perhaps circle back to a few things you said that I commented on as somewhat bleak, but there's elements of hope and despair in your writings. You give great cause for hope and also great cause for understanding and acknowledging bleak situations. On religion and the science front, for instance, you've expressed hope that despite intransigence on the part of creationism and materialist science, leaders can and are breaking through to form bonds across these disciplines. I'd like perhaps if you could elaborate a little bit more on where and how they're doing that.
Well, you guys right here have the experts, Mary Evelyn and John, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. It's just amazing their ability to reach across. Thomas Berry was both at the same time. I don't know how it happened, but I was invited to be a part of a 1992 Religion and the Environment statement from Washington, D.C. There were only two economists invited, Herman Daly and me, and I could understand Herman because he's co-authored with John Cobb. I was extremely unfortunate to also be included and to see this shared interest between religion and people of the cloth and people of the lab coat, so to speak. You know, most scientists are spiritual in various ways, but they can be very negative, and maybe especially at Berkeley. It's a very secular place, even though, you know, another 100 yards up the hill we have the Graduate Theological Union. Most of the people on the campus don't even know it, or they just drive right by and say, "Oh, that's right, it's geological." You know, I mean, the Graduate Theological Union, GTU, and it just no more on their consciousness than driving by McDonald's, which is always on my consciousness because I always get so upset. But I mean, that's just me. And so I just decided that there's probably a latent interest amongst our students, and I teamed up with a theologian at the Graduate Theological Union. He had a postdoc, and the postdoc and I co-taught a course that was for the GTU students and for the lower campus Berkeley students. And we just happened to teach the same, parallel courses in the same room. And is extremely educational for me, extremely educational for my co-teachers from the theological school, and we're still corresponding, we're still back and forthing and helping each other. But many students, years later said, well, that was the most important course they had in, their whole experience, and we were just putting it together from scratch. And sharing our understandings across these divides. And I think there's a lot of that can be done all the time. It's right. There's so much learning that just needs to be shared.
Is it a phenomenon that's exclusive to the academy, this idea of interdisciplinarity, or is it can it be found in other areas as well, policy circles, or in education not in the academy?
I think the academy is the least adept at interdisciplinarity. They're the most adept at talking the talk, but policymakers have to be interdisciplinary. Unfortunately, policy schools now, the dominant thing that is taught is economics and sort of the economic way of doing policy. But historically, policy schools had a little bit of economics, a little bit of systems theory. Political science was being taught, and that has collapsed to, here's a diagram that shows the dead weight loss of this taxation, and it's all baloney. That's the chapter I'm trying to write now. But I was a student of Arnold Harberger, who invented this idea of dead weight loss. He actually ended up being my thesis chair. But no, for many years I felt that the non-governmental organizations, especially the non-governmental research organization, were far more interdisciplinary just because they didn't have to have the categories.
Sure.
And so the World Resources Institute was doing better research, or the Union for Concerned Sciences were doing better research, or even Resources for the Future for a while was trying to be more interdisciplinary. So I think the academy knows it's important, but it has not yet realized the implications of that importance.
Interesting. I suppose, zooming out a little bit, you spoke briefly to the weirdness of our current time. What at this specific political moment gives you hope? Perhaps it's what you've just spoken about, and agencies that influence policy are an area and a source for hope. And are these things that allow you to continue with your work? And then where is hope fading? I suppose, which is not a good way to cap that off. But where do you find hope, and where do you find
hope? It's sort of the ultimate mystery, isn't it? You know, students for years have been asking me, why do I, you know, how is it that I get out of bed each morning? And it's an incredible gift that we have. And we could not, you know, we just could not function without it. It's sort of the underlying basis of getting together and being trustful of each other. It's the underlying basis of, you know, working through problems. If we just didn't have it, but other species must have it too, because we're not the only ones that confront and work through difficulties. I think it's how to capture our individual hope into some kind of a new collective hope is the challenge, and that's where I have more frustration, because you know, Trump doesn't really have an economic philosophy, and Hillary Clinton was the old neoliberal philosophy, trying to fool the poor and the middle class that neoliberalism would trickle down, and it just trickled up. And in many ways, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are more aggressive on the regulation of private enterprise and corporations to work towards a public good. They have a stronger conception of a public good, but they're not yet really, they're more arguing against rather than speaking for a positive philosophy. And maybe this will be the situation in which we will be allowed to come up with a positive mix rather than speaking just an anti-position.
Thank you. You talk, this reminds me about the Glen Canyon experience. You also said in this retrospective book about David Brower,
Yes.
You said that the experience of being in the Glen Canyon, you say here, mad as hell. I think I added the hell here.
It's okay.
If it's not applicable, you can reject that label.
It's okay.
But you said in that book, you have to be pretty mad to join the priesthood, but not be in the priesthood. The priesthood being economics. I'm wondering if it still feels like a priesthood, and what alternative type of priesthood can help us join into the collective action that you're talking about.
And I guess acknowledging we need leaders, and we need people who can help groups formulate and express themselves. I would like that priesthood to be much more flatter, much flatter. And yeah, I don't know how to respond to that. I don't really want an equivalent hierarchy with just a new priesthood. I really do want a flatter system with much more participation all the way through it. And yet acknowledging that we do need communities, and communities do need leaders. But people can lead from different positions and share leadership, and step in and lead in different ways. So with all due respect for priests, I would.
There are probably several future priests in this room.
Yes, yes. I guess here is where my Protestant upbringing maybe is too great.
That's quite all right.
No, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that democratic vision. I think it's a hopeful vision. I think my next question was, if we're trying to translate that individual hope into a collective hope, who does that? Who does that work? But it sounds like you're calling all of us to do that.
I think that's a good answer. And this, you've got the dilemma, right? the horns of the dilemma, so to speak, that on the one hand, to get change, you need leaders of change. And yet the vision I have is of a place with much more of a shared priesthood. And so that's the dilemma I'm in.
And the actual priesthood could benefit from that too, I think.
Okay. Well, I enjoying Pope Francis immensely, and but he's having considerable difficulties of his own.
Certainly.
Yes.
Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
I've enjoyed it immensely myself, so thank you. You guys have reminded me of many things I have written.
Wonderful.
Thanks for your encouraging words.
Well,
and,
I hope I wasn't too discouraging.
No, we hope that we'll have many priests of many types coming out of this room
Thank you.
and this conversation.
Good.